No matter your age, your plan for retirement can start today. From the News Channel 5 Network, this is the Retirement Report.
Good morning. Welcome to the Retirement Report. I'm Hank Parrott, your host. All right, we're going to be talking about in retirement today about investing. This is one of the areas I'm running more and more into as I talk to folks is, how do we invest? How do we get the money that we're going to need in retirement? And this is one of the areas that it's different when you're accumulating money for retirement. So during those working years when you're saving and you're putting money away and you're just trying to basically build up as much as you can for the retirement nest egg, if you will. And what is that retirement nest egg going to be for? Well, that's of course going to be to provide income in retirement. Now this is one of the things, and I covered in the book, 7 Steps to Financial Freedom in Retirement. And by the way, stay tuned, pencil and pen handy. I'm going to give away some books today, show you how you can get the book at no cost towards the end of the show. So stay tuned for that. But one of the things I get into in the book is talking about how basically the changes, how things are different. In the introduction to the book, for instance, one of the things that I cover is when you're accumulating money, and we're going to take a look at one of the worst periods as far as decades in the history of the market. Because here's one of the things when it comes to planning. Most times when you're listening to advisors, what are they telling you? They're looking at what's happened over the last 30 or 40 years in the market, and they're using that as a means to say, look how well the market's done. Now, I'm going to show you something, in fact, to illustrate that. This is a research firm called Dalbar. Dalbar is an independent research firm, and what they do is they research the results in the market from individual investors. All right, so here's one of the things that we find with Dalbar. Now this is over the period from 1993 to 2012. So again, right, the last 20 years. And what do we see? We see the S&P had an average return of 8.21%. Well, you got to think to yourself, wow, if I could get 8% on my money, right? 8.21. I mean, the bank is paying you what? The 0.21. So if we could get 8.21, that'd be pretty good. But what's the problem with the S&P? Well, we're going to get into that as far as the volatility issue. But the S&P 500 index, just to for those who are maybe not as familiar, this is the general broad index used for the market to measure the performance of the market, makes up 500 largest companies. About 70% of the equity in the stock market is represented in these 500 companies. Now, what do we see though with the average equity fund? And this is the other part. When you're investing, all right, in mutual funds, the average equity fund, in other words, the average stock fund, because that's what we're comparing it to, is 100% stocks. The average stock fund, that average investor got a return of 4.25%, about half what they could have got if they just bought an index mutual fund, right? You can go to Vanguard or T. Rowe Price or any number of places and invest in a Standard & Poor's 500 index mutual fund. And you would have gotten that type of, well, a little less than this because there would be some costs involved. And this index is an educational tool, so it's showing what the market did, but that cost would be minimal if you're using an index fund. But compared to what your average investor got in stock mutual funds, that's a pretty considerable difference. And when you take into consideration inflation, this is one of the areas we're going to cover as well and what that means. So one of the reasons for this, that this happens, is one called market timing, okay? The other is the funds themselves. So we're going to get into all of this morning, but think about that for a second. If the S&P 500 index, which outperforms, as I just showed you, the majority of stock equity mutual funds out there, and you got that return of 8.21%, we're thinking, well, wow, that's pretty good, right? Well, what's the problem with that is if we look at the period from 2000 through 2012, all right, so let's take a look at another of my handy dandy charts here, all right? So if we look at the Standard & Poor's, now what I did here was I assumed the person invested $250,000 and they went out and they got a Standard & Poor's 500 index mutual fund, and they invested that $250,000 starting in 2000. At the end of 2000, they would have only had $227,000 left of that $250,000. They went down, right, almost 10% in that year. And then what happened in 2001? Well, the S&P dropped another almost 12%. So now they would have been down to only 200 of their original 250,000. How many people would be very comfortable losing $50,000 of their money, 20%, over 2 years, right? That would make you pretty uncomfortable. Well, then it gets worse because the next year it dropped 22%. Now your original $250,000 investment would only be worth about $155,961. Now, how many people would have been able to stand for that type of volatility, who has sat still, getting that statement coming in each month, seeing their money going down and down and down, and at the end of that 3-year period only have $155,000 left? Now, maybe if you're in a position where you're just saving for retirement, and you're saying, you know, I'm not even going to look at the statement. I'm going to trust in the market that it's going to come back, and that over time this will work itself out. And sure enough, the next year you would have had a gain. Your 155 would have went up to 200, and then up to 222, and in about 4 years' time, you'd have been back to where you started. Okay, so all I had to do was be patient. 4 years later, so now I'm 7 years into my investment, and I'm up maybe about 20,000. I stay put, and then by the end of 07, October 07, when the market peaked, I'm up around 35,000. In other words, about 12% total over a period of about 7 years, or 8 years, excuse me, in that point. So about a 1.5% a year, in other words. But I'm holding still. I'm saying, okay, things are going to get better and better, right? But then what happens? 08, and my 285 drops to 179,000. Ouch! I am now back to a huge negative from where I started. Just when I thought things were getting better, I'm down and by about $80,000 now, or $70,000, excuse me, on my original investment. I'm going to stay put. It'll come back, and sure enough, within a couple of years, I'm back up to 260. I've got my money back, and at the end of 2012, I'm up to $309,000. I've got basically about a 20% gain over a 13-year period. In other words, I'm averaging somewhere in about the 1.5 to 1.75% per year range. Okay, now that's bad enough, and this is why I say when I look at, if I want to show you a chart, or if I'm selling you on the market and I'm saying, look at this S&P, right? 8% return, but what am I doing? I'm taking one of the strongest decades, the 90s, to blend in to show that. And if I really want to make it look better, I get the 80s in there as well, because the 80s and the 90s were the two strongest back-to-back decades in the history of the stock market. So that would make my returns look really good. But how many people are concerned about the last 20 years or 30 years, or for that matter, the last 60 or 80 or 100 years, where we're getting this type of return if we, in other words, incorporate enough years into it? Okay? How many people are concerned about that? Or maybe more concerned about the next 5 to 10 years, right? And that goes back to where we're at when we're looking at the worst decade then. So if I look at one of the worst decades in the market, and this would work for me, then maybe that's something that's going to be more important for me to know. Now again, I remember I said that right from the beginning, when you're accumulating, you can write it out, and over time, 20, 30 years for instance, I'm going to get that 8% return maybe, right? Of course, none of us knows what the future is going to bring. Are we going to ever see a period like the 80s and 90s again? Who's to say? But here's something else to keep in mind, and this is the part that's very, very important in retirement. You're going to start taking money out of those funds. So you're going to go from this accumulation period, and this was a pretty poor one, I'm afraid, but we're going to go from that to where we're taking income. And again, in the introduction to the book, I use a similar example. I think I doubled the numbers as far as the starting point being $500,000 instead of $250,000. But at a 4% distribution rate, And this is considered a safe distribution rate by most planners. That's what we've used, is about a 4% distribution rate. In other words, the percentage we're going to take for income in retirement from our investment. Okay? And what would have happened there? Wow. Now we're really going to see a big difference in terms of the money. I'm going to break these. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, I'm going to get into these numbers a little bit more because it's so important that you understand this. And this is an area that, unfortunately, most advisors don't get into. When you go in to invest at a brokerage house, for instance, this isn't the kind of stuff they're typically going to show you. But here we want you to be that educated, informed investor that's going to help you make the right choices in retirement. All right? We'll get into it as soon as we come back. Join us here on the Retirement Report.